Good evening to one and all. I'm Dr. Susanna Avery-Quash, the Senior Research Curator in the History of Collecting here at the National Gallery. It's my very great pleasure to welcome everyone most warmly on behalf of the National Gallery's trustees and our director, Dr. Gabriele Finaldi, to the National Gallery for the 2022 Ruskin Today Brantwood Lecture in partnership with the National Gallery. I thank immediately and most sincerely Professor Robert Hewitson for his ongoing vital assistance in our 3-year partnership, as well as to my National Gallery colleague Michele Maiolini for his help with all the practicalities for tonight's event. We are most grateful to Brantwood and Sovereign Films for their generous sponsorship of the convivial drinks reception that we've just enjoyed ahead of the lecture, and I hope you thought that was a good way to start this evening's proceedings. For those of you who are new to Ruskin Today, I wanted to draw your attention to this informal organisation that exists to celebrate the life and ideas of the artist, critic, and social reformer John Ruskin. As its website tells us, it brings together the activities of many different societies, academic institutions, and individuals who share an interest in Ruskin and in the many different aspects of his work. I urge you all to visit the Ruskin Today website, which serves as a kind of notice board to draw attention to the many Ruskinian events that take place across the world each year. It's a true honour to introduce Professor Dinah Birch, CBE, our esteemed guest lecturer for the 2022 Ruskin Today Brantwood Lecture at the National Gallery. Professor Birch is Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Cultural Engagement and Professor of English Literature at the University of Liverpool. And I welcome those from the university. I had a chat to some of you over drinks, and it's a pleasure to welcome any member of the University of Liverpool to the National Gallery. Dinah studied at St Hugh's College, Oxford, and also undertook her doctorate at Oxford. In 1980, I was interested to learn that she became the first woman to be elected to the governing body of Merton College, Oxford. She is director of the Liverpool's Literary Festival and runs an annual short story competition for students and staff. She writes regularly for the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, contributes to Melvyn Bragg's well-known In Our Time and Sky Arts documentary broadcasts, and she's also served as a judge on the Booker Prize panel. She was awarded her CBE in the 2016 Birthday Honours List for services to higher education, literary scholarship, and cultural life. Professor Birch has published widely on Victorian fiction and poetry. Her books include Our Victorian Education, published in 2008. She's published editions of Elizabeth Gaskell's Cranford in 2011, and Anthony Trollope's Can You Forgive Her in 2012, and The Small House at Allington in 2014, all with Oxford University Press. She is also the general editor of the Oxford Companion to English Literature. Of particular interest for our Ruskinian event this evening is all the seminal work that Professor Birch has contributed to our understanding of the Victorian art critic John Ruskin. Among her publications is Ruskin's Myths, published in 1988, and she's also edited Ruskin and Gender in 2002, and John Ruskin Selected Writings in 2004. I also couldn't let the occasion pass without noting that Dinah has spoken at the National Gallery on Ruskin before, when, together with Janet Barnes, I organised a conference here that some of you may have attended in September 2019, Art for the Nation, John Ruskin, Art Education and Social Change. On that occasion, we invited Dinah to be our keynote speaker, and she generously agreed and opened proceedings with a most thought-provoking talk about Ruskin and his Victorian readers. That lecture, I'm happy to tell you, is downloadable together with the rest of the conference proceedings and more in the online Journal of Art Historiography, issue number 22, June 2020. Going back to Dinah and Ruskin in matters, she's a companion of the Guild of St George, a charitable educational trust based in England but with a worldwide membership, the aims of which are to uphold the values and put into practice the ideas of its founder, John Ruskin. Well, tonight, appropriately, given her deep knowledge of Ruskin and her roles in UK higher education, Professor Dinah Birch has chosen to address us on her theme, Ruskin and Higher Education, Learning to Think. Ruskin, a lifelong learner with strong views, had sustained relations with universities throughout his adult life, which were often turbulent. While professor at Oxford University in 1872, Ruskin told his students that a university should be a place, quote, where those who wish to be able to think come to learn to think. Not to think of mathematics only, nor of morals, nor of surgery, nor chemistry, but of everything rightly. While, of course, much has changed since Ruskin's time, Professor Birch believes his challenging views can prompt serious reflection about what goes on in universities, how they're governed and managed, what their future could and should be. She has kindly agreed to answer a few questions at the end of the talk. We'll maybe have about 10 minutes. And that Q&A session will be fielded by Professor Robert Hewitson. So please join me now in welcoming most warmly Professor Dinah Birch to give the 2022 Ruskin Today Brantwood Lecture in partnership with the National Gallery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna, for that generous introduction. I hope that you can all hear me. Yes, good. So, it really is an honour to give a lecture in this distinguished series, in this very distinguished place. And it is a particular pleasure for me to make some connections between my lifelong passion for the work of John Ruskin and my own life's work in universities. So, Susanna has just reminded us that in 1872, Ruskin told the students of the University of Oxford, where he was at that point in his life a professor, that the definition of a university is a place where those who wish to be able to think come to learn to think, not of mathematics only, nor of morals, nor of surgery, nor chemistry, but of everything rightly. That's not how universities are seen today, and of course it was not how most people saw universities then. Ruskin's ideas about higher education have always been provocative, and during his lifetime, he was usually a contrary voice when it came to the work of universities. Much has changed since Ruskin's days as a student, teacher, and professor, and necessarily so. Ruskin's insistence that universities can have no serious part to play in any kind of vocational training is far removed from the current social and economic function of universities, where our architects, engineers, lawyers, dentists, vets, doctors, including our surgeons, are trained. And we've moved a long way from Ruskin's vehement aversion to any kind of competitive examination system. It would hardly have been possible for Ruskin to conceive of a system in which opportunities for higher education are as widely shared as they are today. For the academic year 2020-2021, 44.4% of pupils in state-funded secondary education progressed to higher education. I do like a statistic from time to time. That's a fact that would have astonished Ruskin. 50.6% of females in state-funded schools progressed to higher education by the age of 19, compared to 38.4% of males. Women graduates in law, medicine, veterinary science are now in the majority, and those are facts that would have astonished him still more. Ruskin was a pioneer, but he was not a time traveller. Some of his ideas on universities are mired in the assumptions of his generation and class in ways that few would find acceptable today. Those ideas include his advocacy that graduates should work for the extension of British colonies, or his assertion, firmly made, that universities are for the education of gentlemen and ladies. I don't propose to spend my time with you this evening in an exercise in hagiography. Ruskin was wrong about many things, and he could be very tiresome. What I want to do is to reflect on Ruskin's own experiences of higher education as a student, teacher, researcher, professor, and how those experiences shaped his thought. And I want to consider what Ruskin's engagement with higher education might mean to us today about what goes on in universities and what their future might be. Can Ruskin still help us to learn to think? Not all of Ruskin's ideas about higher education have been swept away by the passage of time, despite the fact that more than 180 years have passed since he enrolled as a hopeful young undergraduate at Christ Church, Oxford. The word interdisciplinary was part of no one's vocabulary in those days and is now mainstream in both education and research. Breaking down the barriers between different fields of knowledge was always central to Ruskin's thinking. The conviction that an understanding of art or the practice of art or the study of natural history should play an important part in the work of a university was not conventional in the early decades of the 19th century, but those beliefs mattered to Ruskin from the start. In this respect, he was a pioneer and an influential one, making a major contribution to the construction of Oxford's Museum of Natural History in the late 1850s and becoming the first professor of fine art in Oxford in 1869. His belief that higher education should involve practical activity with constructive ends in view, sometimes focused on the immediate needs of local communities, as in his famous project to work with students to build a road in the village of Ferryhinksey, that belief no longer seems in the least eccentric. And though he would have been surprised by the dominance of young women in higher education today, his support for higher education for women as a professor in Oxford was unusually active and sympathetic at a time in the late 1870s and 1880s when women were first finding a toehold in universities. So, not only a pioneer, but in some ways a prophet. What I want to focus on, first and foremost, is Ruskin's insistence that higher education should not be exclusively a matter of communicating information or knowledge or skills or professional or technical expertise. He wanted a model for universities that would provide the basis for a broader formative experience for students. For Ruskin, learning to think couldn't be exclusively a matter of attending lectures, reading books. It must also involve some form of interaction with the social and material world. Here's more of what he said to those Oxford students in 1872. I quote, "Remember always that you come to this university, or at least your fathers came, not to learn how to say things, but how to think them." How to think them? But that is only the art of logic. You would perhaps answer. No, again, not at all. Logic is a method, not a power, and you come to the university to get that power, or to develop it, not to be taught the mere method of using it. That point about the students' fathers, or at least your fathers came, is very characteristic of Ruskin, somewhat misleadingly claiming the authority of tradition to substantiate an argument for change. There's little evidence that earlier generations of students had really attended the university in order to learn how to think. But for Ruskin, the power of thinking drew on moral and emotional capacities of students and would develop a sense of shared responsibility towards others. That was, in fact, quite a new idea. It would not focus primarily on the need to earn a living, nor, and this is a crucial point, nor would it rule out the possibility of pleasure. Ruskin's thinking about higher education, or indeed any other kind of education, was never joyless. I quote again, "The entire object of true education is to make people not merely to do the right thing, but to enjoy right things, not merely industrious, but to love industry, not merely learned, but to love knowledge." So the two key points in Ruskin's ideas about university education were that it should not be entirely self-interested, nor entirely abstract. Both of those points are rooted, like so much else in his work, in his early years. And it is important to note that Ruskin's own education before he went up to university was not typical for a boy of his class and generation. It was largely taught at home, with the instruction of his parents and predominantly that of his mother, supplemented by a number of visiting tutors. So, why was he not sent to a public school? Eton, perhaps, or Winchester, or Harrow? After all, the family had the financial resources to have made that possible, and they certainly didn't lack ambition for the future of their son. But education was, in the minds of Ruskin's parents, too important to be handed over to others, and this was especially true of religious education. Ruskin's parents were committed evangelicals, and his mother especially wanted to ensure that her son was properly trained in the fundamentals of evangelical religious practice, including a rigorous study of the Bible. And Ruskin would always point to the importance of that early discipline in his acquiring an extraordinary grasp of language and how to use it to the best effect. But those early years also embedded in his mind the concept of education as a process that meant more than the means to personal advantage. Ruskin's parents hoped that he would become an Anglican clergyman, undoubtedly a gentleman's profession, but one which was, as they saw it, rooted in a concept of service, the service of God and man. Ruskin absorbed that principle from his earliest childhood, but he did not become a clergyman. Why not? Because other aspects of his education drew him in different directions. He was taught to draw by very expert teachers, in fact, including Copley Fielding, James Duffield Harding, leading artists of their day, and he took that teaching seriously. He became, exceptionally, for a middle-class boy, at a time when amateur drawing was usually conceived as an accomplishment for girls, a really skilled draftsman and watercolourist. He was sent to a local school, rather briefly, run by Dr. Thomas Dale, a tough and capable evangelical clergyman who had a hand in the foundation of the brand new University of London. Later, as a 17-year-old, 1836, he attended lectures and tutorials at King's College in London, where Thomas Dale had been appointed as the very first professor of English literature and history in the new university. And it's worth noting, this is a fact that pleases me greatly as an English graduate, it is worth noting that Ruskin was one of the very first university students of English literature as an academic discipline in a university, another way in which he was a pioneer. In fact, Ruskin never much liked the domineering Dale, and his experience of King's College in London might be identified as the earliest of the many moments in his life, excuse me, when he was, to some extent, at odds with the university culture that he encountered. Dale, a hardline evangelical, took a dim view of literature that might be seen as immoral. He had, at the time that Ruskin was among his students at King's College, revised and published an approving foreword to the widely read Student Guide by the American John Todd, a fellow clergyman, a book which roundly condemned the work of Lord Byron, Walter Scott, Bulwer Lytton as bad influences. That would not do for the teenage Ruskin. When Dale set Ruskin the essay title, "Does the perusal of works of fiction act favourably or unfavourably on the moral character?" Ruskin made his views very clear. Scott's fiction is, he argued, a force for good, while those who shrank from Byron as a corrupting influence were entirely missing the point. "We do not hesitate to affirm," says 17-year-old Ruskin, very dignified, "we do not hesitate to affirm that, with the single exception of Shakespeare, Byron was the greatest poet who ever lived." So much for the authority of Thomas Dale. And, we may note, so much for the notion which has tiptoed back into some contemporary models for higher education, that we should only read books by authors with morally pure credentials. That was never Ruskin's position. Where was this coming from? It was coming from his father, John James Ruskin, whose influence on Ruskin's intellectual formation was quite as deep and pervasive as that of his mother. John James, born in Edinburgh in 1785, was as much a romantic as he was an evangelical, and in some ways more so. He was an enthusiastic reader, and Scott and Byron, with their Scottish connections, and were among his favourites. He was also a keen theatre-goer and had dabbled in painting as a young man. All of these interests were communicated to his son in full. Ruskin learned from his tutors, but the strongest foundations of his education were laid by his parents, with whom he had an exceptionally close and enduring bond. It was for this reason that he travelled much more widely than was customary for a child or teenager at the time, up and down the roads of Britain with his father, who was visiting his customers as a successful wine merchant, and then on family tours in Europe, northern France, Switzerland, Italy. Ruskin developed a keen interest in geology as a child, collected and studied rocks and gems all his life long. And he began to acquire detailed knowledge of the great buildings he saw on his travels, largely through the practical exercise of drawing them. He had, in short, an educational experience very unlike anything he would have encountered in a public school, where the teaching was predominantly focused on the classics, with a smattering of mathematics and theology. And this was greatly to Ruskin's advantage. By the time he reached his mid-teens, he knew much more about the wider world than most of his contemporaries, and from very different perspectives than was usual among his peers. As an 18-year-old fresher at Christ Church, he was quickly recognised as a distinguished student who didn't quite fit in. He found the classical studies required of him unpalatable and dull, and he was not remotely interested in the gambling and drinking and hunting that seemed to preoccupy most of his fellow students. Ruskin was different. His drawing was admired. He was very proficient. And he worked on his poetry, winning the university's Newdigate Prize for Poetry in 1840, at the third attempt. He made a few lifelong friends, notably Henry Ackland, later an important ally in his attempt to change educational priorities in Oxford. But all in all, Ruskin's time as an undergraduate was not a golden period in his life, and it was not transformative. Christ Church was passing through something of a low point in its long history in Ruskin's student years, and Oxford in general would not regain any intellectual momentum until the reforms of the middle and late decades of the 19th century. Ruskin made his feelings about modern education plain in an appendix to The Stones of Venice. It's published in 1853. And what Ruskin chiefly felt was that conventional practice was entirely inadequate. Here is a brief extract. Until within the last year or two, the instruction in the physical sciences given at Oxford consisted of a course of 12 or 14 lectures on the elements of mechanics or pneumatics, and permission to ride out to Shotover with the professor of geology. I do not know the specialties of the system pursued in the academies of the continent, but their practical result is that unless a man's natural instincts urge him to the pursuit of the physical sciences too strongly to be resisted, he enters into life utterly ignorant of them. I cannot, within my present limits, even so much as count the various directions in which this ignorance does evil. But the main mischief of it is that it leaves the greater number of men without the natural food which God had intended for their intellects. For one man who is fitted for the study of words, 50 are fitted for the study of things, and were intended to have a simple, perpetual, and religious delight in watching the processes or admiring the creatures of the natural universe. Deprived of this source of pleasure, nothing is left to them but ambition or dissipation, and the vices of the upper classes of Europe are, I believe, chiefly to be attributed to this single cause. Learning to think was, for Ruskin, inextricably bound up with the study of the natural world, the proper food for our minds and a perpetual source of delight. And that was not the only problem, as far as Ruskin was concerned. Modern education also despised both religion, here identified as the binding or training to God's service, and politics, or the science of the relations and duties of men to each other. His argument is that higher education should rest on service, on social responsibility, and on the observation of nature. Ruskin remained, at this point in his life, 1853, a fervent evangelical Christian, a faith he was later to lose. And the terms with which he was to engage with educational reform were to change, but the basic premises did not change, and they lay behind his work with like-minded colleagues, like Henry Acland, in supporting the construction of the Natural History Museum in Oxford, which became the first central home for the study of the natural world in Oxford. And Ruskin went on working towards a different approach to higher education, largely in Oxford, his own undergraduate university, but also to a more limited extent in other institutions. He gave drawings and other artifacts to enhance university collections in Oxford and Cambridge, and then in 1869 became Oxford's first Professor of Fine Art, delivering lectures, and in 1871 founding a school of drawing within the university. None of this was quite the smooth assimilation into a university establishment that I am perhaps implying. Ruskin's views and his recalcitrant and sometimes belligerent refusal to smooth their edges were not always what was expected from a professor. Devoted as I am to Ruskin in many ways, as a university leader and manager, there are moments when it occurs to me that Ruskin would have been a nightmare. His celebrated, or in the eyes of some, notorious project to recruit students to construct a new road in Ferry Hinksey was certainly not what was thought to be appropriate to be the dignity of an Oxford professor. He was not a conventional academic. Ruskin was part of a changing approach to higher education in his lifetime, and to some extent helped to shape those changes. But his perspective was always that of an active and practical critic, a figure who was both insider and outsider in the university establishments that he encountered. I want to turn now to give some thought as to how what I have been describing in Ruskin's life and work might relate to developments in our own changing models for higher education. I began by making the point that in many ways Ruskin's thinking is now alien to our own shared values and objectives. But I also mentioned some of the ways in which his approach has become mainstream, as, for instance, in the increasing acceptance of interdisciplinary study as a model for teaching and research. But the point I now want to make is broader. Ruskin lost that ardent evangelical faith as a middle-aged man, but he did not lose his conviction that higher education, all education, should support a definition of thinking that would place a moral dimension at its centre. And this conviction has also become mainstream in university life. In fact, we tend not to use the word moral so much these days. Our preferred term is ethical, which perhaps feels less prescriptive or maybe a bit less prissy, but the basic principle is not very different. And I would argue that as contemporary society has grown more distant from the precepts of religious belief, and churches and chapels have, in general, lost their power of jurisdiction over the ethical dimensions of national life, universities have, to an extent that is perhaps surprising, stepped into that gap. Universities now place their moral, ethical values openly and indeed often urgently at the centre of their work, making the ethical training of their students far more of a priority than was the case in the Oxford and Cambridge of the 1830s, when Ruskin was a student, despite the central part that the Church of England played in those universities at that time. Now, here I am not talking about wokeness or culture wars, the extent and nature of which have been widely exaggerated, often for political reasons. The shift that I would identify is more radical than that. The good that universities can do, or could do, and the public benefit that they represent more widely in their communities, locally and nationally, is now front and centre of their missions. So let me give you a couple of practical examples of what I mean. One of the activities that I've been involved with for many years, in my own experience as an academic leader, is the development of what we now call REF. That is, for those of you outside the world of universities, the Research Excellence Framework, REF. This is the national cycle for the assessment of research across all disciplines and in all institutions of higher education that produce and publish research of any kind. This process began to operate now 30 years ago, and in its earliest years, it focused solely on the intellectual quality of the publications of individual researchers, as assessed by panels of their peers. This is no longer the case. The academic quality of outputs of various kinds is still central to REF, but the introduction of impact, as we call it, or the public benefit of research, has transformed the exercise. First formally assessed in 2014, impact includes benefits of many different kinds, extending far beyond the walls of academia. Impact on society, the economy, culture, public policy or services, health, the environment, quality of life. In the most recent iteration of this exercise, whose results were announced in May 2022, impact accounted for 25% of the scores awarded to the quality of research produced by universities. And this emphasis on outward-facing work in the work of universities is a relatively new thing, not as an optional, nice-to-have element, but as an indispensable feature of their national, local, and civic role. I've mentioned Ruskin's project in Ferry Hinksey a couple of times. Ferry Hinksey is a village close to Oxford, poverty-stricken and poorly drained. That meant that its inhabitants often suffered waterborne diseases. The point of the work, the real point, was to primarily improve the drainage of the village in order to benefit the health of its residents. It was really a public health project. Students provide the labour, and many of them never forgot that experience of purposeful work in a local community. This would not now be seen as self-indulgent eccentricity, as it was seen at the time. It would attract the formal support of a university and would be counted to its credit. Another example of the way in which Ruskin's model of thought is now more closely aligned with the priorities of universities today is to be seen on his emphasis on human responsibility to what we would call the environment, though Ruskin's terminology was different. Studying the natural world, as Ruskin argued that we should, involved taking responsibility for its protection, as Ruskin argued that we must. He was one of the first to identify human activity as a cause of environmental degradation and of climate change, though here too his terminology was different, and one of the first to call for change. This was among the ways in which his lectures were controversial. The historian J.R. Green commented at the time, "I hear odd news from Oxford about Ruskin and his lectures. The last was attended by more than 1,000 people, and he electrified the dons by telling them that a chalk stream did more for the education of the people than their prim national school with its well-taught doctrine of baptism and gabbled catechism, and also that God was in the poorest man's cottage and that it was advisable he should be well housed." But all was not well, as Ruskin repeatedly pointed out, with either the chalk streams or the cottages of the poor. Pure air, water, and earth are, he argued, among the foremost priorities of a properly managed political economy. But British air was clogged with smoke, the land was degraded, and industry had, and I quote, "turned every river of England into a common sewer." All of this has a distinctly modern ring. And in these matters, Ruskin's voice does sometimes sound prophetic. I quote again, "The misuse we made of our discoveries will be held against us in eternal history. Our ingenuity in the vindication or denial of species will be disregarded in the face of the fact that we destroyed in civilized Europe every rare bird and secluded flower. Our chemistry of agriculture will be haunted with the memories of irremediable famine." His late lectures on the storm cloud of the 19th century lamented in apocalyptic terms the pollution of the air and its effect on the climate, ascribing its causes to the aggressive pursuit of self-interest among his contemporaries nationally and internationally. Every university is now engaged with processes of supporting the means of addressing these challenges, not in Ruskin's terms, but with no less passion. The academic community is working towards net zero, developing the resources of clean energy, exploring the means to less reckless agricultural practices, taking biodiversity seriously. Sustainability, as we now call it, is a practical matter, as Ruskin knew, but he also knew that it was a moral and ethical issue. That view was seen as a peculiar minority position in the 1870s when Ruskin was a professor at Oxford. Not anymore. At this point, I just want to return to the point I mentioned earlier about Ruskin's relations with assumptions about education and gender, which dominated the early and middle decades of the 19th century. And those were, from Ruskin's childhood onwards, complex. Schools and universities, indeed all educational institutions, were firmly divided along gendered lines during Ruskin's lifetime, and Ruskin was, of course, located on the masculine side of that divide. And yet, his early interests, educational experiences, and to some extent his understanding of the principles that should govern education tended to place him on the feminine side. I've mentioned Ruskin's attending, briefly, Thomas Dale's school, his first formal experience of education outside the home. All of the pupils were boys, as you'd expect. In his later years, he looked back with some self-mockery on those school days. Finding me, in all respects, what boys could only look on as an innocent, they treated me as I supposed they would have treated a girl. They neither thrashed nor chaffed me, finding indeed from the first that chaff had no effect on me. Generally, I did not understand it, nor in the least mind if I did. The fountain of pure conceit in my own heart, sustaining me serenely against all deprecation. This is revealing. Ruskin had many male friends and colleagues throughout his life, but a high proportion of those he worked with most closely were women: Margaret Bell, Octavia Hill, Margaret Talbot. Many of his most committed followers were women. His goddess of wisdom, a spiritual expression of the energies of nature, was Athena, the queen of the air. This is not to imply that he found men of his own class, generation, level of professional influence intimidating, and he was always perfectly clear about his own authority as a man. He was the master of the Guild of St. George. He was the professor. He expected to be treated as an alpha male. But his gendered identity was not fixed. What he defines in thinking back over his school days as pure conceit, or what we might perhaps more respectfully describe as his utterly unshakable sense of the justification and rightness of his views, primarily derived from his parents, meant that he was often able to stand between gendered identities, arguing for the kind of compassionate or moral feeling in human relations that was then, in general, more conventionally associated with women. And those who were hostile to his writing often picked this up. When Ruskin claimed, for instance, in Unto This Last, his 1860 series of essays on political economy, that an economic model that failed to take social affections into account could never be valid or effective, the stoutly conservative Saturday Review, never anything other than vigorously contemptuous of Ruskin's work, responded that the world was not going to be preached to death by a mad governess. Others remarked on the fact that Ruskin was not what might be identified as a man's man. F.J. Furnivall, celebrated lexicographer and textual scholar, summed up what many of those who met Ruskin noted. I never met any man whose charm of manner at all approached Ruskin's. Partly feminine it was, no doubt, but the delicacy, the sympathy, the gentleness and affectionateness of his way, the fresh and penetrating things he said, combined to make a whole which I have never seen equalled. This was not altogether in tune with the prevailing ethos of mid-century Oxford. Ruskin was always, for instance, as uncompromisingly scornful of competitive team sport as he was of competitive examinations, and he thought that Oxford students' obsession with rowing and cricket was nothing more than a monumental waste of time. In his final term as Slade Professor at Oxford in the early 1880s, when his relations with the university were increasingly difficult, Ruskin gave his active support to the newly founded women's colleges, notably Lady Margaret Hall and Somerville College. In 1887, after he'd left Oxford for good, he wrote to Madeleine Shaw Lefebvre, the first principal of Somerville College, "Whatever I can do for you all is only my duty, all the more as I cannot do anything I meant for the Oxford men. Gone all into cricket and chemistry." incapable of art or true thought. Now, that was a moment of bad temper, of course, and doesn't altogether reflect Ruskin's position. He had many stalwart followers among Oxford's men. But leaving aside for a moment the nuances of Ruskin's gendered identity within higher education, it is the case that gender within the work of universities has undergone a fundamental transformation over the last 30 years at all levels, from undergraduates to vice-chancellors. Women are no longer a beleaguered minority. Even in senior leadership positions within the academy, where women used to be rarely represented, they are taking an increasingly prominent role. This is one of the ways in which Ruskin's presence in the academy, once represented a broadly defined code of values that seemed exceptional, now looks very much more normal. Universities are no longer predominantly a man's world. Ruskin's work cannot serve as an uncomplicated model for changes of direction in higher education. Nothing about Ruskin's life and legacy is uncomplicated. But his example can act as a reminder of principles that continue to be central to the future of universities, that their work is not wholly instrumental, nor entirely to be measured in economic or professional benefit. Those who manage universities know this very well. But though universities are autonomous, they are not entirely independent. They are subject to the policy directions and sometimes to the whims of government. And government intervention in the development of universities in recent years has been neither consistent nor in every sense positive. Ministers for education, higher education, science come and go, sometimes with remarkable rapidity. And universities are required to respond to a bewildering and ever-shifting array of regulations, instructions, and admonitions. Not all of this has been negative, and there have been instances of support for research initiatives or for the widening of participation in higher education that have borne welcome fruit. But universities have suffered from the overly intrusive and sometimes ill-considered interventions, not always grounded in a deep understanding of what they contribute to national and international life on many levels. Recent attacks on the value of arts and humanities or of overseas students in the cultural and economic life of the nation are dismayingly misinformed. But lamentation will not change this unhappy state of affairs. There is no point in our retiring in a huff, sighing and muttering and wringing our hands. It's up to those of us who care about higher education to respond, to inform, to make the case for the work that we do to communicate. Universities are a means of making connections. Connections between people, between different areas of teaching and research, different aspects of civic responsibility and of the economy, of living and working together in mutual respect, of knowing more about art and culture and our checkered history, of understanding the natural world more deeply and taking our stewardship of its resources more seriously. These are all Ruskinian impulses in their deepest identity. Despite Ruskin's frequent exasperation with the world of higher education and its occasional exasperation with him, he knew that universities mattered. They matter still. They will continue to change, But there are no more important beacons of hope for our shared future. They are places where we continue to learn to think. Thank you.
May I share your microphone?
Indeed,
Professor?
you may.
The organisation which presents this series of lectures is called Ruskin Today. And of course, being Ruskinian, it's not an organisation at all, it's just an assembly of friends. But we called it Ruskin Today because today, with the hyphen, was Ruskin's motto. And this evening, no hyphen, I really feel that Ruskin has been brought us up here to today. So thank you very much indeed. Now we have time for some questions, and I would like to ask a question, which is that you talk about the autonomy of universities, and in the 19th century, I suppose the universities were indeed autonomous, being descended from religious institutions or civic institutions and so on. And you mention their autonomy today, but how independent do you really think our universities are today?
That's a good question, Robert. I said that universities are autonomous in a formal sense, that is true, but I did also say that they are not entirely independent. They are, from that point of view, occupying a difficult space between that long history of governing their own affairs, which is still, to some extent, the case. It's not been entirely abandoned. We do still have some element of freedom to do that, but we are also constantly, to put it bluntly, meddled with by those who are pursuing their own agendas, often, as I've said, ill-informed, and by those who impose on universities models of government, of funding practice, for instance, political ideologies, such as we've just seen a painful example in the now departed Home Secretary's attack on overseas students, which made no kind of sense on any level. So the answer to your question is not straightforward. I wouldn't want to say that universities have entirely lost their autonomy. They have a persistence and a resilience that I think will continue to carry them through. But I do think, indeed I know, that freedom is now hedged about by other considerations, which have not always been to their advantage. I don't want to say that successive governments have never made contributions to the work that universities want to do, and I mentioned, for instance, that funding for certain research initiatives, which have been positive, for, as I say again, widening participation, particularly that which has been helpful, and other examples that I could bring forward. But it is now a difficult world. I could, for instance, though I'm a fear I would bore you all if I did so, talk about TEF, the sister of REF, the teaching excellence framework, which has not, it seemed to me, contributed to the excellence of teaching within higher education. I won't say any more, but I do think that is the case.
I'd love to carry on our conversation, but we're all here in a conversation. We have a microphone here available. Would someone like to ask a question? Do you have a point you'd like to make? There's one over there, Michele. This, by the way, is Michele, who we are very grateful to for his assistance in setting up this event. Sir.
Good evening. Thank you first of all very much for your lecture, and I thought your reflection and analysis of the changes in higher education over the last century was very insightful. I'd be interested to hear what you think higher education should do differently over the next century, or in fact should do differently.
Well, my answer could be a long one.
We have time.
But I will try to summarise. I do think that some of the directions that I have pointed to in the development of higher education really have been very positive, and I don't want to sound like a doom merchant. I mentioned, for instance, the breaking down of barriers between different areas of study. I do think that has been very positive, both in terms of teaching and research. It has enabled researchers, students alike to enrich their understanding of the world and to take research into new directions. It was very noticeable in the last iteration of REF, that exercise that I mentioned earlier, that is bearing such good fruit, and I hope that it will continue to do so. An issue where I think progress, if I'm honest, and I will be honest, has been less positive, has been the issue of social class and the participation of young people from low-income families within higher education. And I won't say there has been no progress, but it has been frustratingly slow. I talked about gender in higher education. One of the things that concerns me, often worries me, is the intersection of gender with social class. The fact of the matter is that we are in universities having very much more success in bringing young women from low participation neighbourhoods into universities than young men. And I think that the issue, the challenge of engaging working class boys, let me put it that way, working class is a problematic term, but you will take my point, in higher education is one that is proving quite tough. I think there is a lot more work that we need to do to make sure that everyone does have the opportunity to share in the richness of higher education. I don't think that is yet the case. So that's in a way a kind of reversal of the gender issue that was dominant in the 19th century. I think we have a different version of that now. But the third point that I'll make is one that perhaps you would expect me to make. We are really feeling the pressure in universities to support and resource both our teaching and our research as it needs to be resourced. You will know, I'm sure, that student fees have been frozen for a number of years, 9,250, but as inflation bites harder and harder, that sum of money diminishes in real terms year on year. We don't make a profit, not that that's the right word, we don't make a surplus on home students, nor do we make any money, this won't surprise you, I'm sure, nor should we make any money out of research. Research is not a money-making exercise. It is hard to balance the books, to develop our estates as they need to be developed. Many universities, and I don't think that I would be unfair in saying this would include the University of Liverpool, we do need to invest more resource in making sure that students have the facilities and the buildings that they need. We've made a lot of progress, we've invested a lot of money. There's a lot more that needs to be done in Liverpool and elsewhere. We don't have the resources to do that. So the third point I'd make, would be I'd like to see a system of higher education that is properly and appropriately resourced.
Other questions? A point? There.
Thank you, Dinah. You mentioned that Ruskin would have been a nightmare to manage as a university leader. Is there room for Ruskins in the current university system? And if not, how would you create space for a modern Ruskin?
That's a very good question. The fact is there is room for Ruskins within modern education because Ruskins where they exist, and let us confess they're not common, but where Ruskins do exist, they make their own room, always. And that's as it should be. There are always that small handful of people who are doing, how can I put this, they're doing such good, challenging work that they forge their own path. What I think, and I perhaps made the point flippantly, but it is an important point, what I think is sometimes more difficult are senior academics in all disciplines, men and women alike, and they do exist, who feel, frankly, really very entitled to behave exactly as they choose without being Ruskins. Let me put it that way. And they are a trial to those of us who are trying to deliver the best for students and staff. And I don't think it is appropriate. I don't think it has ever been appropriate for people teaching within universities or working within research teams to feel that they can or should, frankly, behave exactly as they choose. And so I do think there have to be processes of management, but I agree, and I think this is behind your question, that they should not be of a kind that translates academic work into a simple response to a set of regulations. And I can assure you that academics being what they are, there is no danger of that.
Any more? Any more for any more? Yes, please. Marina Warner, I think it is.
I happen to have a small teaching job at Birkbeck, and Birkbeck came second in the RAF, in the English department, and has now been threatened with 50% cuts. So my colleagues are facing an extremely severe situation. You mentioned that we shouldn't lament. Lamentation was not a sufficient response. So please, could you tell us what the practical measures of resistance can be?
Thank you, Maureen. That's a very good question. And it goes back to the point that I made about the resourcing of higher education. It is the case that REF, I keep talking about REF because it was so much a part of my life, that REF measures the quality of research. And it does strengthen the hand of those who are trying to preserve the work of their departments within universities. But the fact remains that research does not generate income. That is a point that I also made. So what we have to do, departments of English, of history, modern languages, classics, philosophy, theology, across the humanities and arts, theatre studies, what we have to do is to communicate to those who are managing universities the real value of the work that we do. Now, I do not pretend, Marina, that this is any kind of simple magic bullet, but there are now groups responding to really remarkable levels of success in REF who are putting resources together, led, for instance, by the School of Advanced Studies in the University of London, who have acquired some funding for this purpose, the British Academy, who are also supporting this work, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, coming together in a kind of loose group to, if you like, to lobby and to persuade, and to do that on evidence. For instance, it is often assumed, it is often said, that graduates in humanities do not succeed in the employment markets, and this is simply a mistake. It is the case that though they don't necessarily, in the short term, move into well-paid graduate employment, if you look at their employability 3, 4, 5 years down the line, you find that their levels of success very, very comparable with graduates in STEM subjects. The creative industries, supported by arts and humanities and by STEM subjects, are hugely important in the British economy, not least in the northeast, in the northwest, but actually also in London. Gaming, for instance, where a surprising number of arts graduates do find employment, is now a bigger industry, turning over more money than pharmaceuticals. And this is something that's often not understood. But I think, too, that partly, though not exclusively, as a consequence of COVID and the pandemic, the lockdown, it's more and more clear how important the work of arts, of culture, of the humanities is in promoting social welfare, in promoting mental health, public health of many different kinds, community cohesion, that it is something that really matters to the life of the nation. So, I mean, it's not that I would say there should be no lamentation. There is much to lament. But lamentation in itself is not going to help. So I and others, colleagues, across universities of many different kinds, in fact, are working to try to make that case. The political climate, about which perhaps the least said the better, has not been favourable to these arguments. But we're in it for the long game. This political climate is, I hope and trust, not permanent. There will be changes. There will be a more receptive audience. And it's up to us not to give up. And that is what we will not do. We will press on. But I don't pretend it's easy, and I know that many colleagues in humanities, arts departments, up and down the land, small and not so small, are having a very difficult time at the moment. I do understand that.
Dinah, thank you very much indeed. We're running out of time, unfortunately. But so again, let me thank you. And to be honest, I'd never heard of TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework. Well, if I were judging TEF, then I would give you Alpha++. Dinah, thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.